Today on Cryptic Mass Guitar, we do the inaugural high gain off between the EVH 5150iii 100 watt stealth head and the 90 watt Mesa Boogie Mark V. So this series here is going to replace the old high gain amp shootouts, which is basically 2 sound samples and not a lot in it. These I wanted to be a little more involved, so using different cabinets and then the regular high gain amp shootouts, a blended sample, and then like sort of similar settings. But one thing here to note as we listen to these are kind of played with my choice of what to play and my choice of settings at the time. It's important to know that if you start messing with the knobs, things will sound different. Things could sound better to you, things could sound worse, so keep that in mind. So we're going to start off with the cabinets. So there's 4 different cabinets. I'll list right here on the screen what cabinet they are and the speakers that are being used in them. You are going to hear some stark differences and stark frequency changes when you go from one speaker to the next. Section 2 is going to be what the old high gain amp shootouts were going to be. So you're going to hear actually 3 sound samples here. First of which is a boosted with an Ibanez TS9 setting, and then the second of which is an unboosted. The third, I'm actually going to use the matching cabinets. So this is actually, the Mark V was designed with the C90, the custom 90 in mind. So I have a Rectifier oversized Slant 4x12 cabinet that has C90s in it, and then I have the matching 5150iii EVH cabinet, which has the G12 EVHs, which are 20 watt, technically 25 watt heritage greenbacks. Section 3, we're going to be listening to a blended sound sample. So you're going to hear the EVH 5150iii hard panned left and the Mark V hard panned right. And this is sort of a similar setting and stuff like that. Just for the sake of what most people use, which I know that's going to be an argument, I do have the ENGL 4x12 XXL cabinet that has vintage 30s in it. Now for the fourth and final section here, we're still going to be using that ENGL 4x12 XXL cabinet with the vintage 30s, because again, that is a little bit more common of a speaker than say a C90 or the Heritage Greenbacks. For this, it is a little... you can skew things here, because the Mark V with the EQ, you can really change things and you can really shape things. The 5150iii isn't going to be as stark of a difference, because the Mark V is an extremely versatile amp, whereas the 5150iii does only a few things. It does it very, very well, but the Mark V, all of the settings don't really work really well for high gain, whereas the 5150iii, even the friggin' clean channel, you can get a high gain setting going on it. So just keep in mind when you're listening to this here, this like 2.5 minute sound sample chop up or whatever you want to call it, you're going to be hearing a lot of differences in gain, because the 5150iii has a lot more gain than the Mark V. Also, the Mark V, I keep it on the extreme for these type of things rather than the 2C Plus or the Mark IV settings, just for the simple fact that the extreme technically would be considered the Mark V itself. So let's go ahead and take a listen. So that's it. That's everything for the inaugural high gain off. I do have to mention here, I'm at the tail end of my extremely busy season for work, and I'm gonna admit here, I'm very, very tired. So throughout this, because this is kind of a test for me, this is kind of a new way that I want to do these, just because I think when I do the high gain shootouts, amp shootouts, it's really for me because I like to play guitar and I like to hear, you know, subtle differences in the amps and stuff like that. So when I make those kind of for myself, and then I throw them out there, and if people like them, whatever. This here, it kind of still acts as a little bit of a reference for me, especially when it comes to using the different speaker types and the blended section. So for me, like if I go through these and I listen, that's something to say like, hey, this amp and this amp work really well together. Or, you know, like if I'm looking for a certain setting or something like that, or you know, like a certain sound, this is an easy way for me to go, does this work or does this work for myself? So again, the high gain off, as I want to call it, they're meant for me, but they can also help other people. But again, I really have to reiterate here, changing the settings will really, 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 really affect things here. So if I did the high gain amp shootouts or the high gain offs, if I did one if I made this video one day every week, on Monday it would sound different than Tuesday and Wednesday, Thursday and Friday and Saturday and Sunday. That's just kind of how I work personally. I like to get different sounds and stuff like that, even though it might sound the same every time. But it is really important to note, changing the settings, using different speakers, using different microphones, because I use a Neumann TLM 107. I use a TLM 107 because years ago, like probably 15 years ago, I did this huge shootout between 40 different mics to find the mic that works best for me and kind of represents what I actually hear when I'm playing in the room with the cabinet, you know, when I'm going deaf. So the TLM 107 is the mic that kind of worked best for me, rather than an SM57, an i5, or E609, or what have you. Those ones, especially the 57, at that time came across a little nasally, so blah. So I don't have any more sound samples that I want to go through because I don't want this to be a hugely long video. But I do find it very important to kind of give some upsides or some like differences here for each of the amps. We'll start off with the 5153 because the 5153, as I stated before, and I don't think it's a fair thing to say, but it is something that is said all the time. The 5153 series does like one or two, it's more than one or two, but you know what I mean? It does one or two things, but it does them really well. The clean channel, which you're not going to hear because it's high gain, in order to actually get a clean sound, the gain has to be almost off completely. If you bring it up like with any bit of gain, it's going to start to distort. But it does high gain really well. It does kind of rocky stuff, and it does that kind of stuff really well. There's a lot of different things that you can do. So I know this is going to happen whenever I make this video. There's going to be two things that are going to be of note here, and that is when you have channel 3 selected, if you change the gain on channel 2, it affects the amount of gain that comes through on channel 3 and vice versa when it comes to channel 2. So you can kind of change your gain by using that. Sort of like what some of the PVs did, where you could kind of actually introduce some presence controls from the opposite channel. And then finally, resonance controls. On the 5153 series, the resonance controls are on the rear of the amp. This is very annoying because I'm not going to take videos of the resonance controls. I like to keep them set at noon. If I find there's too much low end, I will actually take down the presence to about 10:30 or 11 o'clock. I know a lot of people will say the OG had it set to 6, so like 1 o'clock or what have you. Cool. But that is something of note as well. There's resonance controls on here. Don't worry about it. The OG had its own internal resonance, which I guess every amp does, but this you can actually control each channel. There's 3 of them. And then on to the Mark V. The Mark V itself does not have as much gain as the 5153. And I know there's going to be a lot of people out there that argue and say, well, you know what, it's your settings, it's your this, it's your that. It doesn't have the amount of gain that the 5153 has. The 5153 has a ton of gain, and to be honest, I rarely ever play it with it set at noon. I usually have it set down between like anywhere from 9 to like maybe 11. But just because it doesn't have as much gain doesn't mean it doesn't work for high gain, because my good lord, the Mark V series works extremely well for high gain. You can have channel 2 set up for like jazz if you want, you can have it set up for blues, you can have it set up for rock, and then channel 1 is a lot more usable than channel 1 on the 5153. When it comes to high gain on the Mark V, and a lot of people are going to disagree with what I say here, I find that if you actually use a boost out in front, you get a lot more control over your sound, and you get a little bit more pleasing of a high gain sound. There's a lot of people out there when it comes to any Mesa amp, especially dual rectifiers, especially Mark Vs or Mark series, they will just crucify you if you use a boost. But I just find for most Mesa amps, it works really, really well. Gives you a little more control, and especially over that low end, which can be overbearing at times. You just get a little more control with a boost out in front. This is also one of the only high gain amps where I actually use the bright switch. Usually the bright switch for me is something you use on a clean channel, but there's just something about the Mark V where if I have that bright switch enabled on channel 3, that top end, it's not like dual rectifier fizzy kind of a thing, but that top end just works really well when it comes to the bright switch. The EQ, a lot of people do use the V setting, so like the V fan out or whatever you want to call it. I don't always use that. That mid control is usually below the like center line or what have you, but I just find that I'm constantly messing around with the settings. I do like to have my low end a lot higher than, you know, say down low or what have you. So there's a little more emphasis on the low end. I just find that kind of works a little more better on Mesas. But everything else is just kind of a crapshoot. It works with what I feel at the time. I can always find a setting that I really like. Also, as I stated earlier, I do tend to keep the Mark V in the extreme rather than in the Mark IV or the Mark IIc Plus. I don't own a 2C Plus, but I own a Mark IV, a Rev B, and that amp, the gain, how you get your gain is completely different than how you get your gain on the Mark V. It's a lot easier, but you can't dial it in like you can on a Mark IV. The Mark V is very different from the Mark IV, especially if you're using it on the Mark IV setting. But it's kind of day of the week, which one I do prefer. I used to prefer my Mark IV over my Mark V, but I've been finding lately that the low end on the Mark IV isn't, it's a little more flubbier than it is on the Mark V, so there's just a little more control on that. And you also do have to keep in mind that the Mark IIc Plus and the Mark IV and then the Mark V Extreme mode, they have different volume levels as well. So if you're switching from one to the other, you do have to keep in mind that you're going to have to turn it up as you go down, or turn it down as you go up, or whatever you want to call it. So if you go Mark IIc Plus, the Mark IV is louder, the Mark V is louder, opposite way around. But that's it for the, again, inaugural edition of the High Gain Off. This takes a little longer, or a lot longer actually, to make than the high gain amp shootouts, but hopefully it's a little more beneficial to you, because a lot of people don't have the Mesa cabinet that has the custom 90 speakers in it. Most people do have vintage 30s, or like a Marshall with maybe the GT1275s, or like, you know, Greenbacks or Creambacks. There's always going to be a comment that say like, I hate Celestians, I love Eminence, so it's a lot more involved with these. So I'm going to try, as my work schedule gets a lot lighter and, you know, I become more human, I'll be getting into more of these shootouts or high gain offs or what have you. So yeah, just keep an eye open for them. Thanks for watching.